When I walked into the courtroom wearing a dripping wet raincoat, my sister Chloe glanced at her highly paid lawyer and smirked like this battle was already won. My father let out a low, mocking chuckle from the plaintiff's table, and my mother simply huffed, staring past me like I was a piece of garbage tracked in from the street. Their lawyer stood up confidently, adjusting his custom suit, and declared to the room that this was a simple, straightforward inheritance dispute that would not take up much of the court's time. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against their arrogant stares. I simply walked forward and set one single thick black folder on the defense table. It was still damp from the heavy rain outside. The judge stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide as he stared at the official seal printed on that folder. He leaned back in his leather chair, completely ignoring the obnoxious family sitting across the aisle, and whispered a phrase that the microphone barely caught. "I cannot believe it is her." Absolute silence swallowed the room, and in that moment, my family had no idea that their entire fake empire was about to burn to the ground. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, and I am standing in a federal probate court, about to completely dismantle the very people who were supposed to protect and love me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who constantly underestimated your worth and treated you like an outsider in your own home. Growing up in a wealthy, status-obsessed suburb of Atlanta meant absolute privilege to outsiders looking in. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness and harsh judgment permeated every single corner. Our house was a fortress of impossible expectations that I could never quite meet. My childhood was defined by a quiet, insidious form of favoritism. I was the darker-skinned daughter with natural hair that refused to be tamed, while my younger sister Chloe was the lighter-skinned golden child with loose curls and a pageant queen smile. In our social circle, where church politics and superficial appearances meant absolutely everything, Chloe was the trophy my parents paraded around for their friends to admire. I was the inconvenient secret they tried to hide in the background, the daughter they constantly picked apart and criticized. And now that lifelong toxic dynamic had brought us all to this courtroom. We were here over Grandma B. She was the only person in the Washington family who ever truly loved me without conditions. When she passed away 2 months ago, she left behind a stunning historic brownstone in the heart of the city, an estate valued at over $2.5 million. It was a property she and my grandfather had worked their entire lives to pay off. In her will, she left it entirely to me. She knew I would protect it. She knew I respected the deep family history within those walls. But my parents and my sister could not stand the thought of the designated family failure inheriting such a massive asset. So they filed a vicious lawsuit to contest the will, claiming I was mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and entirely unfit to manage the estate. I sat alone at the defense table. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not bring a team of legal associates. I just sat there in my dripping wet trench coat, listening to the rain beat heavily against the tall courtroom windows. Across the aisle, my family looked like they had stepped right out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. My mother, Vivian, wore a tailored cream dress, her pearls gleaming brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. My father, Harrison, sat tall and self-righteous, projecting the exact image of the devoted, wealthy church elder he played so well every Sunday morning. Next to them sat Chloe, dripping in designer labels, clutching the arm of her husband, Derek. Derek was a wealth manager, a man who wore $5,000 suits and drove European sports cars. He was the son-in-law my parents had always dreamed of, a slick talker who knew exactly how to play the part of a high society elite. Their lawyer, a man whose hourly rate probably cost more than most people make in a month, was pacing back and forth in front of the judge. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing off the dark wood-paneled walls. "What we have here today is a tragic case of a deeply troubled young woman. My clients, the Washington family, are simply trying to protect the legacy of their late mother. Naomi Washington is a college dropout, She has no steady employment, no stable background, and a highly documented history of erratic behavior. To hand over a $2.5 million historic property to someone who cannot even manage her own basic life would be a massive disservice to the deceased. I sat perfectly still. I did not object to his lies. I did not roll my eyes or cross my arms. I just let him speak. I let him paint the exact picture my family had spent years meticulously crafting. I pulled my focus back to the present moment. The opposing lawyer was wrapping up his opening statement, gesturing dramatically toward me. "She is a parasite on this family. Your Honor," he declared loudly. "She has lived in the shadows, entirely disconnected from the respectable lives her parents and sister have built. We ask that the court invalidate the current will and hand control of the estate over to Derek, who has the professional financial expertise to manage and liquidate the property responsibly." The lawyer took his seat next to my father. The family exchanged highly satisfied looks. The air in the room felt thick with their unearned arrogance. Derek leaned back in his chair, draping his arm over the back of Chloe's seat. He looked at my wet coat, the rainwater pooling slightly near my boots on the courtroom floor. He leaned over to Chloe and whispered loudly enough for the court reporter to hear. "I told you the failure could not even afford an Uber in the rain. She probably walked all the way from whatever basement she is renting." Chloe let out a soft, mocking laugh. She looked at me, her eyes filled with that same condescending pity she had weaponized since we were teenagers. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed that because she had the light skin, the wealthy husband, and the parents' absolute approval, she was untouchable. She thought I was just the dark-skinned outcast sister who was about to lose the only thing of value she had ever been given. They had absolutely no idea what they had just walked into. They had no idea that while they were busy posing for church bulletins and bragging about Derek's fake wealth, I had been building an empire. They thought I spent the last 10 years struggling in poverty. They did not know that dropping out of college was the catalyst that pushed me to teach myself code, to dive deep into cybersecurity, and to build a forensic data auditing firm that was now valued in the 9 figures. Judge Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked down from his high bench. He was a formidable man known for his sharp intellect and zero tolerance for nonsense in his courtroom. He looked at the family's lawyer, then turned his intense gaze to me. He took in my drenched coat, my silent demeanor, and the absolute lack of legal representation by my side. "Miss Washington," Judge Sterling said, his voice deep and resonant. "Opposing counsel has made some very serious claims regarding your mental fitness and your financial stability. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Have you retained counsel, or do you intend to just sit there?" I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I did not look angry or defensive. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out a single thick black folder. I walked up to the judge's bench and set it down on the solid wood. The cover of the folder bore a very specific, highly classified federal seal. It was the seal of Sentinel Cybersecurity, the premier forensic auditing firm contracted directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, my firm. I watched Judge Sterling's eyes drop to the folder. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. He had seen that exact seal before. He had presided over federal fraud cases where my company had provided the definitive digital evidence to put white-collar criminals behind bars. He knew exactly what that seal meant, and more importantly, he knew exactly who owned the company. The judge stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. His eyes went wide, darting from the federal seal up to my face. He leaned back in his tall leather chair, completely ignoring the obnoxious family sitting across the aisle. "I cannot believe it is her," he whispered the microphone, catching the faint sound of his absolute shock. Silence swallowed the room. The smug smiles on my family's faces began to falter. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. I turned around to face my mother, my father, my sister, and her deceitful husband. I had let them talk. I had let them dig their own graves. Now it was my turn to bury them. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, his gaze lingering on the black folder for another heavy second, before he forced his professional mask back into place. He looked at me, a silent communication passing between us. He understood that the dynamics of this room had fundamentally shifted, even if the opposing counsel and my arrogant family remained blissfully ignorant of their impending ruin. The judge nodded crisply, gesturing for the opposing lawyer to proceed with his case. The slick attorney puffed out his chest, completely unaware that he was walking his clients onto a battlefield entirely unarmed. He called Vivian Washington to the witness stand. My mother stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her expensive cream dress. She walked toward the front of the courtroom with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life performing for an audience. She placed her hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the whole truth, and took her seat in the witness box. Instantly, her posture shifted. The haughty, arrogant woman from the defense table vanished. In her place sat a fragile, long-suffering Christian matriarch, a woman heavily burdened by the cross of an ungrateful, malicious child. She pulled a fresh lace tissue from her sleeve and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. The absolute silence that followed her outburst was deafening. She had said the quiet part out loud. She had stood in a federal courtroom and admitted to financial theft, justifying it with her own deeply ingrained prejudice against my skin tone and my natural hair. She had proven my point better than any piece of physical evidence ever could. She had shown the judge, her lawyer, and her entire congregation exactly who she was. I stood perfectly still, letting her hateful words hang in the heavy air. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I just looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had stolen my future to fund a party, and I felt nothing but absolute triumph. The character assassination she had planned for me had backfired spectacularly. She had just destroyed her own reputation, and this was only the very beginning of my case. Judge Sterling stared down at my mother with a look of absolute disgust. He did not say a word for a long, heavy moment. He just let her unhinged outburst hang in the cold air of the courtroom, exposing the rotten core of the Washington family for everyone to see. Finally, he struck his gavel once against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. He ordered Vivian to step down from the witness stand immediately. My mother, realizing the catastrophic mistake she had just made, shrank back into her seat. Her face was flushed a deep, blotchy red. She avoided making eye contact with the gallery, her fake tears completely dried up, replaced by the terrified realization that her mask had finally slipped in public. The opposing lawyer was sweating profusely. He tugged at his expensive silk tie, frantically shuffling through his legal pads. His entire strategy had hinged on painting me as the villain, and my mother had just practically confessed to financial theft on the public record. Desperate to regain control of the narrative and salvage their sinking ship, the lawyer cleared his throat and called his star witness to the stand. He called Derek. I sat at the defense table, my hands resting lightly on my damp trench coat, watching him spin his web of lies. Derek was incredibly good at this. He was a master of the corporate pivot, wrapping his ultimate theft in the guise of a charitable rescue mission. He turned his gaze toward the judge, placing his hands earnestly over his heart. I have spent the last month working tirelessly behind the scenes to find a solution that benefits everyone involved, Derek testified. The upkeep on a historic brownstone is astronomical. The property taxes alone would bankrupt Naomi within a year. She has no steady income, she has no financial portfolio. It is a burden she simply cannot carry. But out of the goodness of my heart, and utilizing my elite network of private investors, I have miraculously secured a buyer willing to take this burden off her hands. The opposing lawyer prompted him to elaborate. Derek proudly announced that an exclusive investment group known as Apex Holdings had stepped forward with a highly generous all-cash offer of exactly $2.5 million. He claimed he had called in several massive personal favors to secure this deal, working late into the night, sacrificing his own family time with Chloe, purely to save the Washington family from impending financial ruin. My plan is simple and equitable, Derek declared, puffing out his chest. Apex Holdings will purchase the estate immediately. We will avoid the lengthy, complicated escrow process. As the designated executor, I will take the $2.5 million and distribute it responsibly. I will ensure that Harrison and Vivian finally have the comfortable, well-funded retirement they so richly deserve after everything they have sacrificed. He then turned his head to look directly at me. His eyes were cold and filled with unmistakable condescension. And of course I am prepared to be incredibly generous with Naomi. We all know she has struggled immensely since her unfortunate failure at the university. She has debts, she has living expenses. I am fully prepared to allocate a portion of the sale proceeds to completely wipe out her debts and give her a fresh start. It is the Christian thing to do. It is what Grandma B would have truly wanted to see her troubled granddaughter finally debt-free and stable. Chloe was nodding along enthusiastically from the gallery. She looked around at the church members sitting behind her, making sure they were taking note of how incredibly gracious and forgiving her husband was being toward her outcast sister. My father Harrison looked visibly relieved sitting back in his chair, as if Derek had just saved the entire day. They were all buying into the illusion, entirely captivated by the smooth-talking con artist they had welcomed into our family. Derek was not done. He wanted to make absolutely sure the judge understood that I was entirely incompetent. He started throwing out heavy, convoluted financial jargon, attempting to bury me under a mountain of buzzwords that he assumed I could not comprehend. "You see, Your Honor." Derek continued, his tone dripping with patronizing arrogance. Real estate liquidity in the current market requires strategic asset reallocation. We are looking at massive capital gains hurdles, complex zoning liabilities, and potential market saturation. I know Naomi means well. I am sure she believes she can handle this. But her little computer repair gig fixing cracked laptop screens and rebooting hard drives in some dark basement simply does not qualify her to navigate a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. She does not understand the macroeconomic variables at play here. She does not grasp the concept of liquid asset deployment. If she is allowed to retain control of this property, the asset will depreciate rapidly. The estate will fall into foreclosure and the family legacy will be completely destroyed. He smiled a slick, practiced smile at the judge. I am offering a clean, highly profitable exit strategy. Apex Holdings brings immediate liquidity. I bring the fiduciary oversight. We save the house, we save the family, and we save Naomi from her own inevitable financial ruin. The opposing lawyer thanked Derek profusely, treating him like a conquering hero who had just descended from the heavens to bestow his wisdom upon the courtroom. The lawyer turned to the judge and stated that he had no further questions for this outstanding witness. Judge Sterling looked over at my table. His expression was completely unreadable. He had sat quietly through Derek's entire monologue, his hands folded, his eyes darting occasionally toward the federal seal on the black folder I had placed on my desk. He cleared his throat. Miss Washington, the judge, said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" I did not answer immediately. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence build the tension in the room. I looked at Derek, who was sitting back in the witness chair with his legs crossed, looking at me with a smug, victorious smirk. He was practically daring me to speak. He truly believed he had intimidated me into submission with his rapid-fire financial vocabulary. He thought I was just a bitter, unemployed dropout who was entirely out of her depth. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not look intimidated. I did not look overwhelmed. I looked exactly like a woman who was about to dismantle a fraud. For the past hour, I had been sitting in my rain-soaked trench coat. The heavy beige fabric was dripping wet, making me look like a pathetic, unprepared civilian who had dragged herself in from a terrible storm. My family had sneered at it. Derek had mocked it. They had used my damp, disheveled appearance as visual proof of my supposed failure in life. I reached up to the collar of the coat. Slowly, deliberately, I unbuttoned the top button. Derek stopped smiling, his brow furrowed in confusion, unsure of what I was doing. Chloe stopped beaming and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched me from the gallery. I unbuttoned the second button, then the third. I gripped the lapels of the heavy, soaking wet trench coat and let it slide completely off my shoulders. The wet fabric hit the back of the wooden chair with a heavy, satisfying thud, dropping away to reveal the truth underneath. I was not wearing thrift store clothes. I was not dressed like a struggling computer repair technician. I was wearing a pristine, sharply tailored $4,000 Tom Ford suit, The dark charcoal fabric was cut with absolute razor-sharp precision, projecting an undeniable aura of intense corporate power. It was the kind of suit worn by people who owned the buildings Derek rented his office space in. It was the armor of an elite high-level executive paired with a crisp white silk blouse and a subtle diamond-encrusted Cartier watch that flashed brilliantly as I stepped out from behind the defense table. The visual shift in the courtroom was instant and jarring. The pathetic, dripping wet outcast vanished. In her place stood an absolute alpha, a woman radiating a terrifying level of calm authority. A loud collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The church members who had been whispering insults about my appearance suddenly went dead silent. Chloe literally dropped her jaw, her eyes wide as she took in the immaculate tailoring of my suit and the undeniable luxury of my watch. She knew designer fashion better than anyone, and she instantly recognized that my outfit cost more than her entire carefully curated wardrobe. Vivian put her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between me and my father. Harrison gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at me in total shock. But the best reaction belonged to Derek. The smug, arrogant smile completely fell off his face. His confident posture shattered. He uncrossed his legs and sat up straight in the witness box, his eyes locked onto my Tom Ford suit in absolute bewilderment. The slick, high-society wealth manager suddenly looked like a frightened amateur who had just realized he walked into the wrong arena. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. The illusion of his superiority was breaking apart in real time. I did not say a word about his speech. I did not defend my supposed computer gig. I simply smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket, picked up the thick black folder bearing the seal of Sentinel Cybersecurity, and walked confidently toward the center of the courtroom. My expensive heels clicked sharply against the polished wood floor, sounding like a ticking clock marking the final seconds of Derek's fraudulent career. I stopped a few feet away from the witness box, looking directly into his panicked eyes. The power dynamic in the room had completely flipped in the span of 10 seconds, and Derek knew it. He was no longer the savior of the Washington family. He was the prey, and I was holding the knife. The opposing attorney practically leaped out of his expensive leather chair. He could feel the entire energy in the room shifting violently against him, and he desperately wanted to regain control before I could do any real damage. He aggressively straightened his silk tie, his face flushed, and addressed the bench with a frantic, unhinged urgency. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests an immediate summary judgment," he declared, waving his hands wildly toward my side of the aisle. "We have presented our star witness. We have clearly established the undeniable financial necessity of this property sale to protect the Washington family. Furthermore, the defense has provided absolutely no official legal representation today. This is a clear-cut, straightforward case. We respectfully ask that you rule in our favor right now and grant my client full executorship immediately so we can proceed with the sale." He was completely panicked. He wanted to shut me down before I even opened my mouth. He truly thought that by steamrolling over me with legal jargon, he could secure his massive paycheck and leave me in the dust. Judge Sterling did not even look at him. The judge kept his eyes fixed entirely on me, completely ignoring the frantic lawyer flapping his arms at the plaintiff's table. "Miss Washington," the judge asked, his voice steady, projecting a quiet authority that commanded the entire room. "Opposing counsel is correct on one single point. You have not submitted any official notice of representation to this court. I must ask you formally for the record. Do you have a lawyer present with you today to handle this highly complex dispute?" I stood tall, squaring my shoulders in my impeccably tailored suit. The heavy, expensive fabric moved with me as I stepped fully away from the defense table. I met the judge's intense gaze without a single ounce of hesitation or fear. "Your Honor," I replied, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and echoing across the vast wood-paneled room. "I do not need a lawyer to expose a criminal." A massive shockwave rolled through the gallery. The church members sitting in the back rows gasped audibly, clutching their purses and whispering furiously to one another. My father slammed his heavy hands down on the plaintiff's table, his face turning a furious, mottled shade of red. "Objection!" The opposing lawyer shrieked, his voice cracking under the sudden immense pressure. "That is a baseless, defamatory accusation against my client. I demand that statement be stricken from the official record immediately. Judge Sterling raised his hand, silencing the lawyer instantly. Overruled. The judge stated flatly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. The defendant has the floor. You may proceed with your cross-examination, Miss Washington. I turned my attention entirely to Derek. He was still sitting in the witness box, but his earlier swagger had completely evaporated. He tried to adjust his posture desperately, trying to puff out his chest and project that familiar Wall Street dominance he relied on, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I began pacing the polished floor. The transformation was absolute and irreversible. For my entire life, I had been the quiet outcast, the dark-skinned daughter who kept her head down, absorbed their relentless insults, and stayed silent, just to keep the peace in a toxic household. I had allowed them to walk all over me, because I believed that was my designated place in the world. But those days were over. Now every single step I took radiated a commanding, terrifyingly calm alpha energy. The sharp, deliberate click of my heels against the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown clock ticking away the final seconds of their fake lives. I was entirely in my element. This might be a federal courtroom, but to me, it was just another data audit, and Derek was nothing but a highly corrupted file waiting to be permanently deleted. I walked right up to the witness box holding my black folder and locked eyes with my brother-in-law. Let us discuss your miraculous buyer, Derek. I began, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. You testified under oath just a few moments ago that Apex Holdings is an elite high-level investment group stepping in to generously save this estate. You claim they are offering $2.5 million in pure cash to help my parents retire comfortably and to graciously pay off my debts. Yes, Derek replied, his voice pitching slightly higher than normal. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to force his vocal cords to cooperate under my intense scrutiny. Yes, that is absolutely correct. They are a highly reputable firm with vast international resources. I flipped open the first page of my file, scanning the highlighted data blocks. Highly reputable, I repeated flatly. Then perhaps you can easily explain to this court why a private equity firm offering a $2.5 million cash buyout has no operational website, no commercial office space, no registered employees, and absolutely no documented transaction history prior to exactly 30 days ago. Derek swallowed hard. He forced a laugh, a dry, grating sound that held absolutely no humor. He looked toward his lawyer, silently pleading for an intervention, but the lawyer was too busy furiously scribbling notes to bail him out. I would not expect a layman to understand private equity. Derek deflected, waving his hand dismissively in the air. Private investment groups often operate with extreme discretion to protect their wealthy clients' assets. They stay off the radar on purpose. It is standard industry practice for firms to maintain a low profile to prevent market speculation. I did not blink. I flipped to the next page of my detailed audit, running my finger down a column of routing numbers. Standard industry practice, I echoed, keeping my voice dangerously smooth. Is it also standard industry practice for a multi-million-dollar equity firm to list a registered agent address that routes directly to a vacant, abandoned strip mall in Delaware? The courtroom erupted into frantic muttering. My mother, Vivian, leaned forward, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She looked at Derek, waiting for him to smoothly explain away this bizarre fact, but Derek was frozen in his seat. The opposing lawyer jumped up again, knocking his chair backward. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness with fabricated, unverified documents. We have no idea where she procured this supposed information. She has no legal authority to pull corporate registrations. Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down, glaring at the attorney with unfiltered disdain. I said, overruled, counsel. The witness will answer the question immediately, or I will hold him in contempt. Derek was visibly sweating now. A heavy bead of perspiration rolled down the side of his face, soaking into the pristine white collar of his expensive custom shirt. His suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too tight. He gripped the wooden edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. You are taking things completely out of context, Derek stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Chloe. My sister was suddenly looking at her husband with genuine, unfiltered confusion. She was used to Derek having all the answers, and seeing him stumble in public was breaking her perfect reality. Corporate structures are layered for tax purposes. Derek rambled, speaking faster and faster in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. It involves complex financial instruments, offshore routing protocols, and capital gains deferments. Real estate liquidity in the current market requires strategic asset reallocation. We are looking at massive capital gains hurdles and complex zoning liabilities that require holding companies to shield the primary investors. He paused, taking a shaky breath, trying to gather his rapidly crumbling confidence. He looked at me, taking in my expensive suit, but his massive ego refused to let him accept defeat. He sneered at me, falling back on the exact same family playbook they had used to break me down for years. He tried to put me back in my place, desperate to reassert his dominance over the woman he had always considered inferior. "Look," Naomi Derek said condescendingly, leaning forward over the witness stand and using a tone usually reserved for a slow, misbehaving child. "I know you are upset about your grandmother, but I would not expect a college dropout to understand high-level wealth management. You fix computers for a living. You reboot hard drives and untangle cables in a dark basement. You do not understand macroeconomics. You do not understand how real substantial money moves through the global market. Leave the complex financial heavy lifting to the professionals before you embarrass yourself and your family any further." The entire courtroom held its collective breath. My mother let out a small, highly satisfied sigh from the plaintiff's table. She genuinely believed Derek had just put me back in my designated box. My father nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest with a look of pure vindication. They were so blinded by their own prejudice and their desperate need to be right that they could not see the massive tidal wave coming right for them. But the smug, arrogant smile on Derek's face faltered heavily when he saw my reaction. I did not look hurt. I did not look insulted. I did not shrink back, lower my gaze, or raise my voice in a defensive panic. Instead, I gave him a cold, predatory smile that made his blood run absolutely cold. I closed my black folder with a sharp snap that echoed loudly in the silent room. "Oh, I understand it perfectly, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that carried across every single inch of the courtroom. "Let us talk about Apex Holdings." I opened the thick black folder. The crisp sound of the heavy paper turning echoed sharply in the silent courtroom. I pulled out a stack of stamped certified financial documents and handed the first copy to the court bailiff, politely requesting he pass it directly to Judge Sterling. I kept a second copy for myself, gripping the edges of the paper as I turned my complete attention back to the man shrinking in the witness stand. "Apex Holdings is not an elite high-level investment group," I began reading from the top sheet. My voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. "It is a shell company. It was registered in the state of Delaware exactly 42 days ago. That date, Your Honor, is precisely 1 week after my grandmother received her terminal diagnosis." I stepped closer to the witness box. Derek refused to meet my eyes. He stared rigidly ahead, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "Delaware is notoriously friendly to anonymous corporate structures." I continued pacing slowly across the polished hardwood floor. It is the perfect place to hide ownership from prying eyes. The registered agent for Apex Holdings is nothing but a post office box in a rundown strip mall. However, when you follow the initial capitalization of that LLC, the money trail becomes highly illuminating. The firm was funded with a deposit of exactly $500 drawn from a checking account at First National Bank. That checking account belongs to a secondary private trust called Horizon Ventures. I reached into my folder, retrieved a second document, and handed it to the bailiff. "And if we subpoena the incorporation documents for Horizon Ventures," I said, holding up my copy for the entire room, "to see we discover that the sole managing director, the only individual with signing authority and total financial control, is Derek Vance." A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. My mother Vivian let out a strangled gasp, pressing her hand hard against her chest. Chloe jolted upright in her seat, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the wooden railing in front of her. She stared at her husband, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to smoothly explain the complex tax strategy he had bragged about earlier. But Derek was not laughing. His face had turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. The expensive, custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked far too tight across his shoulders. He tugged at his silk tie, attempting to loosen the collar of his shirt. Despite the cool air conditioning running through the federal building, a thick layer of sweat had erupted across his forehead. "You did not find a miraculous buyer for my grandmother's estate, Derek," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You are the buyer. You set up a fake company to purchase a $2.5 million historic property from my family. You intended to use your position as the designated executor of the estate to approve a sale to your own anonymous shell corporation." The opposing lawyer scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "The defense is testifying. She is presenting unverified financial documents without proper foundation. My client is a respected wealth manager, and this is a blatant attempt to smear his professional reputation." Judge Sterling did not even blink. He flipped through the certified pages I had provided to him, his eyes scanning the irrefutable data. "The documents are certified with Federal Banking Stamps, Counsel," the judge replied coldly, not looking up from the pages. "The foundation is solidly established. The objection is completely overruled. Miss Washington, you may proceed with your line of questioning." The lawyer slowly sank back into his chair, looking at Derek with dawning horror. He was finally realizing that his respected client had lied to him and had just walked him into a massive legal disaster. I turned back to Derek. "Here is the most interesting part of your brilliant financial strategy," I said, leaning casually against the edge of the defense table. "You claim Apex Holdings is offering a $2.5 million cash buyout, but you do not actually have $2.5 million to pay for it, do you?" Derek swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically toward the courtroom doors, as if calculating the exact distance he would need to cover to escape the room. "I audited your personal and professional accounts. I continued relentless in my delivery. I traced every single wire transfer, every offshore deposit, and every heavily leveraged margin call you made over the last 18 months. You have been running a highly sophisticated, incredibly reckless shell game. You took massive risks with your clients' portfolios, and when the market turned, you lost everything. You are entirely broke." "That is a lie," Derek croaked out, his voice barely a whisper. His arrogant, booming Wall Street persona had completely vanished. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are misinterpreting standard investment losses." I challenged, flipping to the final section of my audit. "Let us look at the liabilities. You did not want to sell Grandma B's house to fund my parents' retirement. You did not care about giving me a generous fresh start. You needed to forcefully liquidate her estate because you owe money. A massive amount of money, and you do not owe it to a standard commercial bank." I walked right up to the wooden railing of the witness box, standing inches away from him. Derek recoiled, pressing his back hard against the leather chair. "You owe $1.8 million to a syndicate of private, unregulated lenders operating out of Macau and Cyprus," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving tone. "Loan sharks. Dangerous, violent people who do not care about your country club membership or your elite social standing. People who have been threatening you with severe physical consequences if you do not produce their money by the end of this month." I turned away from him and faced my parents. Vivian and Harrison looked absolutely paralyzed. The color had completely drained from my father's face. "Your plan was incredibly transparent," I told Derek, making sure my family heard every single word. "You were going to execute a fraudulent transfer of the deed to Apex Holdings. Instead of paying cash to the estate, Apex Holdings would issue a worthless promissory note to my parents, promising to pay them their retirement funds at a later date. Meanwhile, you would take the physical deed to the brownstone, use it as collateral to secure a hard money loan, pay off your dangerous creditors in Cyprus, and then immediately declare bankruptcy under the Apex LLC. You were going to leave my parents holding a worthless piece of paper while the bank foreclosed on their mother's historic home. You are going to leave them with absolutely nothing. Derek completely snapped. The pressure, the exposure, and the sheer terror of his impending ruin finally broke his carefully constructed facade. He sprang up from the witness chair, his face turning a dark, furious shade of purple. Spittle flew from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "She is hacking!" Derek screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently off the high ceiling of the courtroom. "She is illegally hacking into secure servers. She is making this all up." He slammed his hands down on the railing, leaning over it like a caged animal. He looked wildly at the judge, desperate to regain any shred of control. "Your Honor, you cannot listen to her," he yelled, his chest heaving. "Look at her. She is just a bitter IT worker. She fixes computers in a basement. She is a college dropout who has always been jealous of my success and my marriage to her sister. She hacked into my files and altered the data to frame me because she wants to steal the estate for herself." Judge Sterling picked up his wooden gavel and slammed it down repeatedly, the sharp cracks cutting through Derek's hysterical shouting. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Mr. Vance, you will sit down and compose yourself immediately, or I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs for contempt of court." Derek fell back into the chair, panting heavily. He wiped the sweat from his face with a trembling hand, his expensive suit now wrinkled and disheveled. He looked completely unhinged. The slick elite wealth manager had been replaced by a cornered, desperate criminal. I stood in the center of the room, entirely unfazed by his screaming. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his frantic insults. I just looked at him with a cold, terrifying smile. He had tried to use my past against me one final time, falling back on the tired family narrative that I was just a bitter failure. He still believed I was the helpless, dark-skinned outcast they could easily step on to get what they wanted. He had no idea that his frantic accusation of illegal hacking had just handed me the key to his absolute destruction. Derek's screaming hung in the cold air, a pathetic display of a cornered predator desperately trying to claw his way out of a trap. But before Judge Sterling could even raise his gavel to order the bailiff to restrain him, the gallery exploded into absolute chaos. My father Harrison could no longer contain the fragile, highly curated image of respectability he had spent decades building. He shot up from the plaintiff's table, his heavy wooden chair scraping violently across the polished floor. His face was twisted in absolute rage, a thick vein bulging dangerously against his temple. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at me, completely ignoring the federal judge sitting just feet away and the armed bailiffs moving toward the aisle. "How dare you!" Harrison bellowed, his voice vibrating with the self-righteous fury of a man accustomed to absolute obedience and zero accountability. "How dare you stand in a court of law and lie about your brother-in-law? He is a respected man of God. He has done nothing but try to save this family from your destructive, selfish behavior. You are possessed by jealousy and spite." Vivian was right beside him, nodding frantically, clutching her pearl necklace as if my very presence was a physical assault. She looked back at her church friends sitting in the gallery, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, desperately trying to secure their alignment and sympathy. She needed them to believe I was the villain, the unhinged prodigal daughter returning only to spread chaos. She tugged at Harrison's sleeve, trying to maintain some semblance of decorum, but he shook her off, too blinded by his own wounded ego to see the optics of his outburst. I did not shrink away from my father's booming voice. I did not cower like the frightened, obedient child he always demanded I be. I squared my shoulders, letting the immaculate tailoring of my Tom Ford suit frame my absolute authority, and I fired back with a force that shook the room. "A respected man of God," I echoed, my voice booming through the courtroom, easily overpowering his hysterical shouting. I did not need to scream to command the room. The sheer, undeniable weight of the truth carried my words to every single corner of the federal building. "Is that what we are calling him now, Harrison? Because he writes a generous tithe check with stolen money, because he shows up to Sunday service in a leased Mercedes-Benz, wearing a tailored suit, bought on credit, and smiles with those light eyes you all worship so much." Harrison opened his mouth, his face turning an even deeper, more dangerous shade of crimson, but I cut him off completely. I stepped away from the witness box, turning my back on a sweating, hyperventilating Derek, and walked directly toward the plaintiff's table. I locked eyes with the man who had failed to protect me my entire life. The man who had enabled my mother's cruelty just to maintain the illusion of a perfect household. You sit in the front pew every single Sunday. I stated, my tone razor sharp and absolutely unforgiving. You stand at the pulpit adjusting your expensive tie, and you preach to the congregation about grace, about unconditional love, and about the sanctity of family. You love to play the wise, benevolent church elder. But the reality is that you spent the last decade emotionally abusing your own child. You and Vivian spent my entire life breaking down your darker-skinned daughter because I did not fit your shallow, color-struck country club aesthetic. The church members in the gallery gasped a collective sound of shock and horror. Some covered their mouths, finally seeing the ugly reality behind the polished Washington family facade. The women who had praised Vivian's pristine outfits and Harrison's profound sermons were now witnessing the vile truth of their household. I did not break eye contact with my father, watching his righteous anger slowly morph into profound panic as his public image disintegrated. I was the wrong kind of daughter, I continued, my voice ringing with lethal precision. I was too dark. My coils were too tight. My ambitions were too unconventional. You tossed me aside like garbage, treating me like an embarrassment, and you eagerly handed the keys to our family legacy over to a charismatic con artist simply because he fit your superficial, light-skinned ideal of success. You worshipped his aesthetic so much you never bothered to look at his ledger. You valued presentation over character, and now it is going to cost you everything. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my words was suddenly shattered by a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. Chloe sprang up from the front row of the gallery. Her perfect high society composure had completely disintegrated. The polished, elegant wife she pretended to be was gone. Her face was contorted in an ugly, desperate snarl, her manicured hands balled into tight fists at her sides. She could not handle watching her husband be humiliated on public record, and she absolutely could not stomach the reality that her supposedly inferior sister was the one holding the executioner's axe. "You are just pathetic," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she leaned aggressively over the wooden railing separating the gallery from the court floor. "You are insane. You are completely mad because Derek is a self-made millionaire, and you are a nobody. You are just a bitter, jealous nobody, fixing laptops in a dirty basement." She pointed wildly at the certified financial documents resting on the judge's desk, her chest heaving with frantic, desperate breaths. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the lavish lifestyle Derek provided, and the cognitive dissonance required to maintain that illusion was breaking her mind in real time. "Those papers are fake. You probably printed them out yourself to ruin my marriage because nobody has ever loved you. You could never land a man like Derek. You dropped out of college, you failed at life, and now you are trying to drag my successful husband down to your miserable, pathetic level." Chloe was shaking from head to toe, her designer dress shifting erratically as she hurled insults across the room. She was fighting for her life, clinging to the country club memberships, the luxury vacations, and the pristine Instagram image that Derek's fraudulent money had bought her. She truly believed her husband was a self-made millionaire, completely blind to the fact that her luxurious lifestyle was built entirely on debt fraud and stolen inheritance. Judge Sterling picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with tremendous force, the loud crack cutting sharply through Chloe's hysterical screaming. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his voice echoing with absolute fury. "One more outburst from the gallery, and I will have this entire courtroom cleared and hold every single one of you in contempt. Sit down and remain silent." Chloe collapsed back into her seat, bursting into loud theatrical tears. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as if she were the ultimate victim of a grand conspiracy. Vivian reached over the railing, frantically patting her golden child's shoulder, trying to soothe her while throwing venomous glares in my direction. My father slowly sank into his chair, looking around the room as he realized that the church members, the very people he sought to impress, were staring at him with undisguised disgust. The absolute silence that followed the judge's order was heavy with the weight of shattered reputations. I stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom, letting their desperate outbursts fade into the cold air. Derek was still sitting in the witness box, wiping his face with a trembling hand, looking like a man who knew he was about to lose his freedom. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide and terrified as he stared at the financial audit lying on the judge's desk. They thought I was a basement-dwelling IT worker hacking into servers out of spite. They thought I was fabricating documents because I was bitter and jealous. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, and their staggering arrogance was the final nail in their coffin. I had waited years for this exact moment, meticulously gathering the evidence, building the impenetrable armor of my success, and waiting for them to walk willingly into my trap. The character assassination they had planned for me had spectacularly backfired, exposing them as the shallow, manipulative frauds they truly were. Judge Sterling adjusted his glasses, looking from Derek's sweating face to my unbothered stance. The judge did not need any further convincing. The documents spoke for themselves, and the panicked, unhinged reactions of my family only validated every single piece of data I had presented. Miss Washington, Judge Sterling said, his tone remarkably calm, considering the explosion that had just occurred in his courtroom. You may continue your cross-examination. I turned away from my crying sister and my humiliated parents walking back toward the podium. I rested my hands on the polished wood, leaning slightly forward, as I locked eyes with Derek once again. The game was over, and I was about to deliver the final crushing blow. I did not even get the chance to ask my next question before the opposing lawyer completely lost his grip on reality. He practically lunged over the plaintiff's table, his face shining with a slick layer of panicked sweat. He slammed his hand flat against the wood, pointing a trembling finger at the certified financial documents resting on the judge's desk. Your Honor, I object to the admission of every single page in that folder, the lawyer shouted, his voice cracking violently under the sheer pressure of his collapsing case. This is an absolute farce. We have clearly established the defendant's background and character. She is an unemployed college dropout. She fixes laptops in a basement. It is legally and physically impossible for a civilian with absolutely no credentials to obtain highly classified offshore banking records from unregulated lenders in Cyprus and Macau. He stepped out from behind his table, gesturing wildly toward me as if I were a dangerous street criminal who had wandered into a federal building. She has no legal standing, no subpoena power, and no security clearance. The lawyer continued, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. Those documents must be stolen, illegally hacked, or entirely fabricated. I demand they be stricken from the record, and I demand the defendant be taken into custody for presenting forged evidence to a federal court. Judge Sterling did not flinch. He slowly lowered the certified banking documents to his desk and removed his reading glasses. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the rain lashing against the tall glass windows seemed to amplify, filling the heavy silence. He looked at the opposing lawyer, then shifted his gaze to Derek, who was clutching the edge of the witness stand like a man standing on the gallows. Finally, the judge turned his eyes to my parents sitting in the gallery. His expression was one of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a single deafening crack. The sound snapped through the courtroom like a whip. The gallery went dead silent. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to breathe. Unemployed Judge Sterling repeated, his voice dangerously low and thick, with unfiltered contempt. Counsel, are you entirely unaware of who is standing in my courtroom today? The opposing lawyer froze in his tracks. He blinked rapidly, his mouth hanging slightly open as he looked back and forth between the bench and me. I do not understand, Your Honor. The lawyer stammered, his arrogant bluster entirely deflated. She is Naomi Washington. Her family has already testified to her lack of employment and her failure to complete her university education. Judge Sterling picked up the first page of my audit, holding it up so the plaintiff's table could see the heavy embossed federal seal stamped at the top of the paper. Let the official record reflect that this court formally recognizes CEO Washington. Judge Sterling announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. He looked directly at Derek, whose face had gone from a sickly gray to a terrifying translucent white. Miss Washington is not an unemployed dropout, and she certainly does not fix laptops in a basement. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Sentinel Cybersecurity. A sharp collective gasp swept through the church members in the gallery, but Judge Sterling raised his hand, silencing them instantly. He was not finished. Sentinel Cybersecurity is a premier forensic data auditing firm. The judge continued, reading directly from my certified credentials. They are not civilians' counsel. They are contracted directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Homeland Security. Their explicit mandate is to track international financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the movement of illicit funds through offshore shell companies. The opposing lawyer actually stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his wooden chair. He collapsed into his seat, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he stared at me. The realization of what he had just walked into was paralyzing. He had brought a knife to a nuclear war. She did not hack your client's files. Counsel Judge Sterling stated, delivering the final crushing blow with lethal precision. She ran a federally sanctioned, highly classified forensic audit on his wealth management firm on behalf of the United States government. Your client was already under active federal investigation for wire fraud and money laundering long before he ever set foot in this courtroom. CEO Washington was the lead investigator assigned to dismantle his shell company. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit the courtroom with the force of a freight train. In the front row of the gallery, Chloe stood perfectly still. The arrogant, screaming high society wife who had just insulted me moments ago was completely gone. Her eyes were glazed over in total shock, unable to process the data her brain was receiving. Her perfect manicured fingers slowly uncurled. The pristine white quilted leather of her classic Chanel handbag slipped from her grasp. The heavy gold chain hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the dead silent room. She did not even look down to retrieve it. Her entire fraudulent identity, funded by her husband's stolen money, was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her. My father, the proud, righteous church elder, who had just condemned me as a jealous failure, looked like he had been struck by lightning. Harrison's mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes darting frantically from the federal seal on my documents to the impeccable tailoring of my Tom Ford suit. He was suddenly realizing that the daughter he had emotionally abused, the daughter he had deemed too dark, too loud, and too difficult to love, was a highly powerful, immensely wealthy executive working directly with the FBI. Vivian was completely paralyzed. The fragile, long-suffering Christian matriarch mask had melted away, leaving behind a terrified, hollow woman. She had spent a decade convincing everyone in her social circle that I was a bitter outcast. She had drained my college trust fund to pay for Chloe's lavish wedding, assuming I would simply fade away into poverty. She had stolen my future to fund her golden child's aesthetic, completely unaware that her theft had forced me to build an empire that would ultimately destroy them all. Derek was entirely broken. He slouched over the railing of the witness box, his face buried in his hands. He was weeping. The slick, confident con artist, who drove a leased Mercedes-Benz and wore a heavy gold Rolex, was crying openly in federal court. He knew exactly what this meant. He was not just losing his attempt to steal Grandma B's historic brownstone. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The loan sharks in Cyprus would be the least of his problems once the Department of Justice finished dismantling his life. I stood in the center of the room looking at the absolute devastation I had just orchestrated. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt nothing but the clean surgical satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. I turned my gaze away from Derek and looked directly at my parents. They flinched under my cold, steady stare. "You love to tell everyone that I was a college dropout?" I said, my voice cutting smoothly through the sound of Derek's pathetic sobbing. "You loved using that label to justify your neglect. But you conveniently left out the reason why I dropped out. You drained my $150,000 educational trust to pay for Chloe's wedding flowers and catering. You left me with absolutely nothing. You assumed that without your money, without your approval, and without your country club connections, I would simply fail." I took a slow step toward the gallery, my expensive heels clicking sharply against the floor. Chloe flinched, shrinking back into her seat. But you underestimated me, Harrison. I continued my tone, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. When you stole my tuition, I did not cry. I taught myself how to code. I built encryption software in a tiny apartment. I sold my first cybersecurity patent for $2 million before I turned 23. I built Sentinel cybersecurity from the ground up, and I turned it into a federal asset. While you were sitting in the front pew, praising the Lord for your fake wealth, I was sitting in secure briefing rooms with federal agents tracking the exact criminals your beloved son-in-law was working for. I turned my attention back to Derek, who could not even lift his head to look at me. Apex Holdings is finished, Derek, I stated, sealing his fate on the public record. The federal authorities have already frozen the accounts. The SEC has already seized your firm's assets. Your attempt to illegally liquidate my grandmother's estate to pay off your offshore debt was the final red flag we needed to secure the federal indictments. I looked at the opposing lawyer, who was staring at his desk, desperately trying to mentally distance himself from his client. You wanted a summary judgment, counsel, I said, allowing a cold, predatory smile to grace my lips. I strongly suggest you withdraw that motion and focus your energy on securing a federal criminal defense attorney for Mr. Vance. Judge Sterling nodded slowly, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He looked down at the plaintiff's table. This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be entirely fraudulent and entirely without merit. Judge Sterling declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The request to force the sale of the estate is denied. Full executorship of the property is immediately granted to CEO Washington, as explicitly outlined in the original untampered will. Furthermore, I am ordering the bailiffs to detain Mr. Vance in holding until the federal agents waiting in the hallway can take him into custody. 2 armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, moving swiftly toward the witness stand. Derek did not fight them. He simply offered his wrists, his expensive custom suit rumpling as they locked the heavy steel cuffs around his hands. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoed perfectly alongside the sound of my sister's horrified sobbing. I walked calmly back to the defense table. I picked up my damp trench coat, draping it effortlessly over my arm. I did not need to wear it anymore. The storm was over, and the Washington family had been entirely washed away. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open as the bailiffs marched Derek out. Chloe was already scraping her chair back, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands, desperate to escape the gallery and the burning stares of her former friends. Harrison and Vivian were doing the same, gathering their coats with trembling hands, their posture completely broken. They thought the humiliation was complete. They thought they could crawl back to their pristine suburban mansion, hire a crisis management team, and spin a new narrative about how they were the unsuspecting victims of a fraudulent son-in-law. They were entirely wrong. Your Honor, I called out, my voice slicing cleanly through the shuffling noise of the retreating gallery. The defense is not yet finished. I have one final piece of evidence to submit into the official record. Judge Sterling raised a hand, signaling the bailiffs at the doors. Nobody leaves this courtroom, the judge commanded. His voice echoed like thunder, freezing my parents and my sister right in the middle of the aisle. Mr. Washington, Mrs. Washington, you will return to your seats immediately. Harrison swallowed hard, his face pale and shining with sweat. He grabbed Vivian by the elbow, pulling her back to the wooden bench. Chloe sank into her seat, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she were about to be physically sick. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted black USB drive. I held it up so the judge and the opposing counsel could see it clearly. I submit Exhibit B into the record, I stated, walking forward and placing the drive onto the bailiff's tray to be transferred to the bench. This drive contains legally obtained timestamp security footage captured directly from the interior of my grandmother's Beacon Hill brownstone. Specifically, it contains the audio and visual recordings from the main second-floor hallway on the exact night she passed away. The opposing lawyer, who had just spent the last 5 minutes staring blankly at the wall, suddenly scrambled to his feet. He looked like a man fighting for his life on a sinking ship. "Objection!" The lawyer shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. "Your Honor, this is a blatant ambush. We have not reviewed this footage during discovery. Furthermore, Placing hidden cameras inside a private residence is a gross violation of privacy laws and constitutes illegal wiretapping. This alleged evidence is entirely inadmissible. Judge Sterling did not reach for his gavel. He simply looked at me, waiting for my response. The cameras were not hidden. Counsel, I replied, turning my head to look directly at the lawyer. And it is completely fascinating that you are so eager to block footage from the night my grandmother died before you even know what it shows. I turned my attention back to the judge, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Your Honor, 5 years ago, my grandmother's health began to rapidly decline. I explained, my voice steady, though a cold, hard knot of grief had formed in my chest. She required around-the-clock supervision. I pleaded with my parents, who held complete medical and financial power of attorney at the time, to hire a qualified night nurse. I presented them with highly recommended home care agencies. I begged them to prioritize her safety. I paused, letting my gaze drift toward the gallery, where Harrison and Vivian were shrinking under the intense scrutiny of the courtroom. They explicitly refused. I continued, my words landing like heavy stones. My father claimed a night nurse was an unnecessary, frivolous expense that would drain the estate. He stated that Grandmother B was just being dramatic. So, because they refused to provide adequate medical supervision, I used my own personal funds to install a highly secure, closed-network environmental monitoring system. It was done legally. I obtained written notarized consent from my grandmother, and I posted the legally required surveillance notices at every entrance of the brownstone. The system was designed to alert my phone if her heart rate monitor dropped or if there was a loud crash. Judge Sterling turned a cold, withering glare toward the opposing counsel. The foundation for this evidence is rock solid. The judge declared, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for argument. The defendant had legal consent. Proper signage was posted, and the cameras were installed for the explicit purpose of medical safety. Your objection is overruled, counsel. Sit down. The lawyer collapsed into his chair, wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Bailiff, load Exhibit B onto the courtroom monitors, Judge Sterling ordered. The lights in the federal courtroom dimmed slightly as the large, high-definition screen suspended above the jury box and the witness stand flickered to life. The sharp, static hum of the audio connecting filled the massive room. Every single eye was glued to the screens. In the gallery, Chloe let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She recognized the hallway on the screen immediately. It was the polished oak corridor of Grandma B's house. The timestamp in the bottom right corner glowed in stark white numbers. It read November 12th. The time was 11:42 at night. The video was in crisp, clear color. The hallway was softly lit by a wall sconce. The door to Grandma B's master bedroom was slightly ajar on the left side of the frame. For the first 5 seconds, the courtroom was totally silent, save for the ambient background noise playing through the speakers. And then the sound started. It was a terrible, wet, rattling gasp. It was the sound of a woman desperately fighting for air, her lungs failing her body straining to draw in oxygen that simply would not come. The agonizing, rhythmic wheezing echoed violently through the federal courtroom. It was visceral. It was horrific. It was the undeniable sound of a human being dying in extreme distress. In the gallery, Vivian slapped both hands over her mouth, a muffled sob tearing from her throat. Several church members closed their eyes, unable to bear the sheer agony captured in the audio. On the screen, 2 figures stepped into the frame. It was Derek and Chloe. They were standing directly outside Grandma B's bedroom door, perfectly illuminated by the hallway sconce. They were dressed in formal evening wear, having just returned from some lavish country club charity gala. Derek looked annoyed, adjusting his silk bow tie, while Chloe was holding her phone, her thumb scrolling mindlessly through her social media feed. The terrible, suffocating gasps continued from the bedroom, loud enough that they were echoing into the hallway. "Derek, you need to go in there and check on her." Chloe's voice played through the courtroom speakers, sharp and irritated. "That noise is giving me a massive headache. Just prop her up on some pillows or something so she stops wheezing. We have that brunch with the mayor's wife tomorrow morning, and I need to get some sleep." On the video, Derek scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not move toward the bedroom door. "I am not going in there, Chloe," Derek replied. his recorded voice dripping with absolute callousness. "It smells like a hospital room." "She is fine. It is just fluid in her lungs. The doctor said this would happen." "She sounds like she is choking," Chloe complained, not even looking up from the glowing screen of her phone. "Should we call the paramedics?" "If she dies tonight, it is going to completely ruin my schedule for the entire week. The florist needs my final approval for the gala centerpieces tomorrow." The utter depravity of her words sent a shockwave through the courtroom. The judge stared at the screen, his jaw set in a rigid, furious line. I stood at the defense table, my fingernails digging so hard into the wood that my hands ached, forcing myself to watch the footage I had already analyzed 100 times. "Do not call the ambulance," Derek snapped on the recording. He stepped closer to Chloe, lowering his voice, though the high-tech microphones captured every single poisonous syllable. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe. The new estate transfer documents have not been fully processed by the county clerk yet. If she goes to the hospital now and they stabilize her, they might run a psychiatric evaluation. If they deem her unfit, or if she complains to the doctors about the property transfer, the entire Apex Holdings deal is dead. We lose the house. We lose the equity." "But she cannot breathe," Chloe hissed back, finally looking up from her phone, her face twisting into a selfish, inconvenienced pout. "Let nature take its course." Chloe Derek ordered, his tone devoid of any human empathy. "She is 84 years old. Her heart is failing. If we just go to bed and wait until morning, the problem solves itself. We find her peacefully passed away in her sleep. The house goes into the trust, I execute the sale to Apex, and we walk away with $2.5 million in untraceable cash. We can pay off the Cyprus lenders, and we are completely clear." On the screen, Chloe hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. She looked toward the partially open door where the agonizing, desperate wheezing was growing weaker, more ragged, more panicked. "Fine." Chloe sighed on the recording, rolling her eyes as if sentencing her own grandmother to a slow, agonizing death was nothing more than a minor annoyance. "But if the house smells like a corpse tomorrow, you are dealing with the cleaning crew. I am not ruining my new shoes." The video showed Derek wrapping his arm around his wife's waist. They turned their backs on the bedroom door, leaving the frame. The video continued to play for another 30 seconds. The sound of their bedroom door clicking shut echoed in the hallway. And then the courtroom listened in complete paralyzed horror as the desperate wet gasping from Grandma B's room slowly sputtered, weakened, and finally faded into absolute terrifying silence. The timestamp on the screen rolled over to 11:46. She was gone. The video cut to black. The courtroom monitors turned off, plunging the federal building back into the cold, harsh light of reality. The silence that engulfed the room was so heavy it felt suffocating. No one spoke. The opposing lawyer was staring at his desk, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the sheer evil he had just been forced to watch. I looked up at Judge Sterling. The judge's face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped his gavel. He was not looking at me or the lawyer or the documents. He was staring directly into the gallery, his eyes locked onto Chloe and Harrison with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. Chloe was curled into a tight ball on the wooden bench, shaking violently, letting out high, panicked whimpers. She had just watched herself on federal monitors conspiring to commit negligent homicide. She had just broadcasted her absolute lack of humanity to a room full of federal officers, a judge, and the very church congregation she had spent her life trying to impress. I turned my body, facing the gallery, facing the people who had called me a bitter, ugly outcast. "You did not just try to steal her house," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the stunned, silent room. "You let her drown in her own lungs so you would not be inconvenienced. You traded her life to pay off loan sharks." I looked at my father, whose face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a corpse. "You let this happen, Harrison." I stated my words, striking him like physical blows. "You handed the keys to her house, to her safety, and to her life, over to a monster because he drove a nice car and wore an expensive suit. You are equally responsible for every single second she suffered in that room." I turned back to face the bench, my posture perfectly rigid, my duty finally completely fulfilled. The defense rests, Your Honor. I had stated my posture perfectly rigid, my duty finally completely fulfilled. Judge Sterling did not strike his gavel. He did not dismiss me. He stared at the blackened monitors above the jury box, his chest rising and falling with heavy, controlled breaths. The entire courtroom remained trapped in a suffocating, horrified paralysis. Do not rest just yet. E.O. Washington. Judge Sterling commanded, his voice slicing sharply through the heavy air. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with a furious demand for absolute, uncompromising justice. This court needs the complete timeline. The footage we just witnessed occurred at 11:42 at night. This court must establish premeditation. Did they know she was in active medical distress prior to the moment of her death? Is there earlier footage? I did not flinch. There is Your Honor. I turned back to the defense table, my fingers flying across the sleek illuminated keyboard of my laptop. I am rewinding the encrypted file to exactly 8:15 p.m. on that same evening I explained to the court, my voice completely devoid of emotion. This is precisely 3 hours and 27 minutes before the previous clip. This specific footage captures the exact moment my sister and her husband departed the brownstone for the evening. Play it, Judge Sterling ordered. His tone had lost any trace of standard judicial neutrality. It was the voice of a man demanding to expose the true face of a monster. The massive high-definition monitors, suspended above the jury box, flickered back to life, casting a harsh pale glow over the silent federal courtroom. On the screen, the grand foyer of Grandma B's historic Beacon Hill house appeared. Chloe and Derek stepped into the frame. They were fully dressed for a high society event. Chloe was adjusting a heavy diamond necklace, checking her flawless reflection in the gilded antique mirror by the entryway, while Derek impatiently checked his gold watch. They looked pristine, wealthy, and perfectly curated. But beneath the rustle of their expensive silk and tailored wool, another sound echoed down the grand, sweeping staircase. It was Grandma B. Her voice was weak, incredibly strained, and filled with a raw, terrifying panic. She was calling out for Chloe. She was crying out for help. She was telling them in ragged, breathless gasps that she could not catch her breath. The audio was so clear, so agonizingly desperate, that several people in the courtroom physically flinched. In the gallery, Vivian let out a strangled, broken gasp. She pressed her hands hard against her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as if she could physically block out the sound of her own mother begging for her life. Harrison gripped the wooden bench in front of him, the knuckles of his hands turning completely white. On the screen, Chloe did not run up the stairs to aid her grandmother. She did not reach into her designer clutch for her phone to dial emergency services. Instead, she let out a loud, exaggerated groan of pure, unadulterated annoyance. She turned to her husband, her face twisted in a mask of supreme irritation and supreme selfishness. Derek, if we call 911 now, we will miss the mayor's charity gala. Chloe's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. Her tone was sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. Everyone from church will be there. Derek did not even look toward the staircase. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his face entirely unbothered by the agonizing sounds of an elderly woman suffocating in the room right above them. Just leave her inhaler, Derek's voice replied, captured with absolute crystal clarity by the advanced security microphones I had installed. She will be fine for a few hours. We cannot miss this networking opportunity. On the screen, Chloe hesitated for less than a second. She grabbed her purse from the entry table, giving her reflection one last admiring glance. She did not run upstairs to deliver the inhaler. She did not check the oxygen tank. She did not even call out to assure her grandmother that help was coming. She simply linked her arm through her husband's arm. The video captured them stepping out into the cool November night. The heavy mahogany front door swung shut behind them. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt echoed through the courtroom, ringing out with the absolute finality of a coffin slamming shut. For the next 30 seconds, the video simply showed the empty foyer. The only sound was the distant, agonizing struggle of an 84-year-old woman fighting for air in an empty, echoing house. They had left her to die alone. I cut the feed. The screens went pitch black. The courtroom listened in absolute horror to the deafening silence that followed. The air in the room felt thick, toxic, and utterly revolting. The sheer callousness of the crime had paralyzed every single person present. Harrison and Vivian turned slowly in their seats. They stared at their golden child in pure, unadulterated horror. The pristine, immaculate illusion of their perfect daughter shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of their eyes. This was the daughter they had relentlessly praised. This was the daughter they had drained my college trust fund for. This was the daughter they had held up as the shining beacon of Christian virtue, elegance, and high society success. And she was a murderer. Vivian's face was a mask of absolute devastation. Her hands dropped from her ears, hanging limply at her sides. She stared at Chloe, her mouth opening and closing silently, entirely unable to process the staggering magnitude of the evil she had just witnessed. Harrison looked as though he had been physically gutted. The proud, booming, arrogant church elder was completely reduced to a hollow, trembling shell of a man. He looked from the blackened screens to his eldest daughter, his eyes wide with a revulsion so deep it seemed to age him a decade in seconds. "You left her," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking, breaking the heavy silence of the courtroom. "You left my mother to die so you could go to a party." Chloe realized in that exact moment that she had lost absolutely everything. Her husband was in handcuffs. Her fraudulent wealth was gone. The federal government was seizing her assets. And now, the impenetrable shield of her parents' unconditional worship had been ripped away entirely. She was completely exposed, backed into a corner, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. So she resorted to the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She played the victim. Chloe threw herself forward against the wooden railing of the gallery, bursting into violent, hysterical tears. She let out a loud, theatrical wail, her face turning red and blotchy as she reached out desperately toward our parents. "It was a mistake," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking wildly as she sobbed. "We did not know it was that serious. She was always coughing. She was always complaining. I thought she just wanted attention. You have to believe me, Mom. It was just a mistake." She was hyperventilating, wiping her tear-streaked face with shaking hands, frantically searching the gallery for any shred of sympathy. But the church members who had once fawned over her designer dresses and country club status were now staring at her with cold, uncompromising disgust. People were physically leaning away from her, visibly repulsed by her very presence. The women who used to compliment her perfect hair and her perfect marriage were shaking their heads in quiet, profound horror. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a blade of solid ice. I walked slowly away from the defense table, crossing the polished hardwood floor until I was standing directly in front of the gallery railing. I looked down at my older sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet, lethal authority in my tone commanded the entire room. "Spilling coffee is a mistake, Chloe," I stated, my eyes locking onto her terrified, tear-soaked face. "Forgetting a lunch appointment is a mistake. Leaving an 84-year-old woman choking on her own fluids while you check your lipstick in the mirror is a calculated, cold-blooded choice." Chloe flinched, shrinking away from me, her heavy sobs turning into desperate, breathless hiccups. She tried to look away, but I refused to let her escape my gaze. "You heard her crying for help?" I continued, relentless and unforgiving in my delivery. "You knew she was in active respiratory failure. But you decided that rubbing shoulders with the mayor and showing off your stolen diamonds was more important than your own grandmother's life. You did not want to ruin your schedule. You did not want to miss a networking opportunity. You locked that door and you left her in that house knowing exactly what was going to happen." I turned my gaze away from my weeping sister and looked directly at Harrison and Vivian. They were completely broken, staring at the floor, absolutely unable to look me in the eye. "This is the daughter you chose," I told my parents, making sure every single person in the gallery heard my words clearly. This is the legacy you sacrificed my future to protect. You spent my entire life telling me that I was socially unfit, that I was an embarrassment, that I lacked the grace and refinement required to be a true Washington. You worshipped her because she knew how to play the game, how to dress the part, and how to smile for the congregation. But under all that expensive fabric and all that country club etiquette, there is absolutely nothing but rot. I looked back at Chloe, who was now clutching the wooden railing as if it were a life raft. You are not a victim, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. You are exactly what Derek is. You are a fraud. You are a parasite. And now the entire world knows exactly what you are. Judge Sterling picks up his gavel once more. He did not look at Chloe with pity. He did not view her as a grieving granddaughter or a confused socialite. He looked at her as a dangerous, remorseless liability to society. Bailiff's Judge Sterling commanded, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. Take Mrs. Vance into custody alongside her husband. I am officially holding her as an active accessory to negligent homicide conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder abuse. She is a direct flight risk and a danger to the public. Remand her immediately. Chloe let out a blood-curdling, terrifying scream as two armed federal marshals stepped through the gallery doors, moving straight toward her. She scrambled backward, knocking over the heavy wooden chairs in her desperate attempt to get away, but there was nowhere to run. They grabbed her by the arms, effortlessly hauling her to her feet despite her frantic kicking and screaming. "Mom, help me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings of the courtroom as the marshals forced her hands behind her back. "Dad, do something. Do not let them take me." Harrison and Vivian did absolutely nothing. They sat frozen in their seats, staring straight ahead, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of what they had raised. They did not reach out to save her. They did not speak a single word of defense. They simply let the marshals drag their golden child out of the courtroom, her hysterical, panicked screams fading down the long marble hallway of the federal building. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, cutting off the last desperate echoes of Chloe's wailing. The federal courtroom descended into a thick, suffocating quiet. The air was entirely devoid of oxygen. The sheer magnitude of the revelations had fundamentally altered the gravity in the room. Judge Sterling stacked his papers with slow, deliberate precision. He looked out over the remaining occupants with a heavy sigh, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had just witnessed the absolute bottom of human depravity. With a final sharp crack of his gavel, the judge adjourned the session. He stood and exited the bench without another word, leaving the wreckage of the Washington family behind him. The spell broke. A low, furious murmur swept through the gallery. The church members, the very people Harrison had invited to witness his grand triumph, were now shifting in their seats, whispering frantically to one another. I watched them pull their coats tight, their faces twisted in profound revulsion. They were looking at my parents, not with the reverence reserved for a pious church elder and his devoted wife, but with the abhorrence usually reserved for violent criminals. Harrison felt the shift. He felt the cold, unforgiving weight of their judgment bearing down on his shoulders. I watched the exact moment his priorities realigned. A normal father would have been paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his eldest daughter had just conspired to murder his mother-in-law. A normal father would have been weeping for the tragic, suffocating death of an 84-year-old woman. But Harrison Washington was not a normal father. He was a narcissist entirely consumed by his own public image. He stood up from his chair. He did not look toward the double doors where his daughter had just been dragged away in handcuffs. He did not look at the darkened monitors that had broadcasted Grandma B's final, agonizing moments. He looked straight into the gallery. He saw Elder Thompson shaking his head in absolute disgust. He saw Sister Miller whispering furiously to the woman beside her, pointing a judgmental finger at Vivian. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Harrison's features. The pristine, untouchable reputation he had spent 40 years cultivating was currently burning to the ground, turning to ash right in front of his congregation. He frantically smoothed the lapels of his suit, attempting to summon the booming, authoritative pastoral presence that usually commanded entire auditoriums. He forced his facial muscles to relax, painting on a sickeningly desperate, placating smile. He abandoned his catatonic wife at the plaintiff's table and walked swiftly across the polished hardwood floor, closing the distance between us. He stopped just a few feet away from me. He reached out his hands, trembling slightly, palms turned upward in a gesture of frantic surrender. He looked around the room, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes burning holes into his back. "We can handle this privately," Harrison begged, his voice a hushed, frantic hiss. He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour stench of his nervous sweat. He was pleading, stripping away every ounce of the domineering arrogance he had wielded against me for 27 years. "Please," Zara, Harrison whispered, his eyes darting wildly toward the gallery before locking onto mine. "We are family. Do not destroy our name in public. We can fix this. We can sit down with the lawyers, go over the estate, and make this right. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell the congregation we are handling this internally as a family matter." I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the man who had spent my entire existence making me feel like a worthless outsider in my own home. I looked at him with eyes made of absolute unforgiving ice. "You want to talk to me about family," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the cavernous space. I did not keep my voice down. I projected every single syllable so that the lingering church members in the back row could hear exactly what their esteemed elder was saying. Harrison flinched, holding up his hands, desperately trying to quiet me. "Zara, keep your voice down," he pleaded, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Please, think about what you are doing. Think about the legacy. You did not care about family when you let me sleep in my car at 19. I fired back my words, slicing through his pathetic defense like a scalpel. The memory flared in my mind, cold and sharp. I had been a teenager working 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford community college classes after they drained my trust fund for Chloe's wedding. I had begged him for a tiny loan to fix my broken alternator. I had asked him to co-sign a lease on a tiny roach-infested apartment so I would not have to sleep in parking lots during the freezing winter months. You stood on the porch of your massive suburban mansion. I continued, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look at the exact daughter he had tried to throw away. You looked at me, shivering in the cold, and you told me that my struggles were a punishment from God because I refused to conform to your standards. You told me that I was a lost cause and closed the heavy oak door in my face. You went back inside to a warm fireplace and a hot dinner, and you left your own flesh and blood to freeze in the back seat of a broken-down Honda Civic. Do not dare stand here and invoke the word family to me now. Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the gallery. He could hear the shocked murmurs erupting from his congregation. The women who had praised his charitable donations were now gasping in outright horror at the revelation of his profound cruelty. That was different. Harrison stammered, his polished vocabulary completely deserting him. "We were trying to teach you discipline, Zara. We were applying tough love so you would find your way. We never meant for things to get out of hand." "Tough love." I echoed, a cold, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Is that what you call accessory to real estate fraud? Because you certainly did not care about family when you helped Derek try to steal Grandma's house today." Harrison took a stumbling step backward, raising his hands as if to physically ward off the accusations. "Zara, I did not know what Derek was planning. He lied, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperate perjury. I had no idea about the loan sharks or the shell company. I was just trying to manage the estate. I was just trying to do what was best for the family finances." I cut him off, my voice ringing with lethal precision. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You may not have known the specific names of his offshore creditors, but you knew Derek was completely broke. You knew he had blown through Chloe's trust fund, and you knew he needed capital to maintain the illusion of wealth that you value above human life. You deliberately ignored Grandma B's explicit wishes. You deliberately tried to force a fraudulent sale to line your own pockets and protect your daughter's fake high society lifestyle." I stepped right into his personal space. Harrison shrank back, looking small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. "You did not care that she was suffering," I said. my tone dropping to a deadly reverberating register. You did not care that she was gasping for breath in the dark, while you were busy rubbing elbows at a country club. You knew Chloe and Derek were neglecting her, but you looked the other way, because demanding proper medical care would have exposed the fact that the family was broke. You traded your own mother-in-law's safety for a pristine social facade. I gestured sharply toward the wooden benches behind him. You only care because the people from your congregation are sitting right there in the gallery watching your fake empire burn, I stated, laying his darkest, most pathetic truth bare for everyone to see. You are not sorry that a woman was essentially murdered in her own bed. You are not sorry that your daughter is a monster. You are only terrified that you can no longer walk into the sanctuary on Sunday morning and have people bow down to your imagined greatness. Harrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked past me, his eyes widening in absolute despair. I followed his gaze. The church members had heard enough. Elder Thompson stood up from the front row, his face hardened in an expression of absolute disgust. He did not say a word to Harrison. He simply turned his back, buttoned his heavy wool coat, and walked straight toward the exit. Sister Miller followed immediately. Then the choir director. Then the treasurer. One by one, the entire congregation stood up and filed out of the federal courtroom. They did not stop to offer their sympathies. They did not pause to pray for the Washington family. They walked out with their heads held high, actively refusing to even glance in Harrison's direction. "Wait!" Harrison called out weakly, his hand extending toward the retreating crowd. "Please, brethren, we must pray on this. We must find grace." No one stopped. The heavy double doors swung open and closed, the sound echoing like a steady drumbeat of finality. Within 60 seconds, the gallery was completely empty. Harrison's arm dropped limply to his side, his chest he heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. The empire he had sacrificed my childhood to build was gone. The respectability he had valued above my safety, above my happiness, and above my grandmother's life had vanished like smoke. I looked at him one final time, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical closure. He was a stranger to me now. He had always been a stranger, but now the biological obligation that tied us together was officially severed. I turned my back on him and walked over to the defense table. I calmly packed my laptop into my leather briefcase. I gathered the certified financial audits, the encrypted USB drives, and the federal subpoenas, sliding them carefully into their designated compartments. I snapped the gold clasps shut. Vivian was still sitting at the plaintiff's table, staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. She had lost her golden child, her mansion, her social status, and her mind. Harrison was standing alone in the center of the vast courtroom, surrounded by empty benches and the ruins of his carefully constructed lies. I did not offer a goodbye. I did not offer closure or a final parting insult. I simply picked up my briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them alone in the cold, echoing silence they had built for themselves. I reached the heavy brass handles of the courtroom doors, the cool metal firm beneath my fingers. I was ready to push them open and step out into the clean, quiet hallway, leaving the wreckage of my former family behind, forever. The trial was over. The estate was safe. My duty to Grandma B was complete, but Harrison could not let it go. His pride, battered and bleeding on the polished floor, demanded one final pathetic stand. He could not tolerate the idea that I held the power to walk away on my own terms. "We do not need you," Harrison shouted, his voice echoing frantically across the empty benches. "You think you have ruined us, Zara? You think taking the brownstone destroys the Washington legacy? I have my own estate. I have my pension. I have my home. Vivian and I will rebuild. We will hire a new public relations firm. We will hire the best defense attorneys for Chloe. We will survive this, and we will do it without you. You are nothing to us." I stopped. My hand slipped off the brass handle. A cold, surgical precision washed over me. I had originally intended to let the federal agents inform him. I had intended to let the banks deliver the foreclosure notices by certified mail. I had planned to let them discover their ruin in the quiet isolation of their own home. but hearing his booming, arrogant voice clinging so desperately to the illusion of his wealth ignited a quiet, absolute resolve in my chest. He needed to hear it from me. He needed to look me in the eye when the final pillar of his fake empire crumbled into dust. I turned around. The clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb as I walked slowly back down the center aisle. Harrison's defiant posture faltered with every step I took. His bluster evaporated, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. He swallowed hard, retreating slightly, until his back hit the edge of the plaintiff's table. Vivian finally lifted her head, her vacant eyes tracking my approach with mounting terror. I set my leather briefcase onto the heavy oak desk. I snapped the gold clasps open. I reached into the deepest compartment of the briefcase and retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. It was dense with certified bank records, wire transfer logs, and property deeds. I held it for a brief second, feeling the weight of their absolute destruction in my hands. I dropped the folder flat onto the wooden desk. It landed with a loud, resounding thud that made Vivian flinch in her seat. "You want to talk about protecting the family, Harrison?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Let's talk about your retirement." Harrison stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the documents and my face. "My retirement accounts are perfectly secure. Derek handles our portfolios. He provides us with quarterly statements. He is a premier wealth manager." "Derek is a premier con artist," I corrected, sharply, sliding the first stack of papers out of the folder and spreading them across the table. "And you handed him the keys to your entire financial existence." I pointed to the top document. It bore the seal of a major international bank, covered in red federal audit stamps. "Derek did not just mismanage client portfolios," I explained, dissecting the anatomy of his ruin with absolute clarity. "He ran a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He promised impossible double-digit returns to wealthy investors using new capital to pay off the old clients. He fabricated the quarterly statements he sent to you. He printed them on high-quality paper to keep you docile and ignorant. But when the market shifted 2 years ago, the entire structure began to collapse. He started borrowing heavily from unregulated offshore lenders in Cyprus and Macau to cover the massive gaping holes in his ledger. Those lenders do not send strongly worded collection letters, Harrison. They demand immediate liquidity, or they dismantle your life." Vivian was shaking now, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles were stark white. "What does that have to do with us?" she whispered, her voice fragile and terrified. "Derek manages Apex Holdings. He keeps his business separate from our personal accounts. We trusted him." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Derek did not respect boundaries, Vivian. When the offshore sharks started circling, he became desperate. He needed massive amounts of collateral to secure extension loans, but his own assets were already leveraged to the breaking point. His leased Mercedes and his rented office space meant nothing to international creditors. So he looked for the easiest, most gullible marks he could find, people who trusted him blindly, people who handed over their financial power of attorney without ever reading the fine print." I slid a property deed across the table. It was the deed to their pristine 6-bedroom suburban McMansion, the house they used to host lavish country club dinners, the house they had kicked me out of. "This is the current title to your home," I stated, tapping the heavy black ink at the bottom of the page. "4 months ago, Derek secretly leveraged your property. He used the blanket power of attorney you granted him to forge your signatures on a secondary authorization form. He took out a massive high-interest commercial mortgage against your house. He drained every single ounce of equity you had built over the last 30 years. Harrison's face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks until his skin was the color of ash. He picked up the paper, his hands trembling violently. "No." He gasped, his eyes scanning the numbers, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. "This is impossible. The bank would have called us. We would have received notices in the mail. They cannot do this without a phone call." Derek rerouted all the primary correspondence to his own corporate office, I explained with surgical precision. He was the registered financial agent on the property. The bank assumed he was acting on your explicit orders. Your 6-bedroom mansion is completely underwater, Harrison. The offshore lenders defaulted on the secondary mortgage 3 weeks ago. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings yesterday morning. Foreclosure! Vivian repeated the word, tumbling from her lips like a foreign language. She looked around the empty courtroom as if expecting someone to step out and announce this was a prank. We are losing the house. We have nowhere to live. Where are we going to put our things? It gets much worse, I said, showing absolutely zero mercy. I pulled the final stack of documents from the folder. These were the certified logs from their personal banking institutions. I laid them out in a neat, undeniable row. Derek knew the mortgage money would not be enough to satisfy his creditors. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. The house merely bought him a few extra weeks of breathing room. When the lenders threatened to expose his entire operation to the Securities and Exchange Commission, he went back to the well. He accessed your primary retirement accounts. I pointed to the final balance on Harrison's 401k statement. The number printed in the box was a bold, glaring 0. He drained it, Harrison, I said, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. Every single cent you saved over your 40-year career is gone. He liquidated the mutual funds. He cashed out the municipal bonds. He took the early withdrawal penalties on the chin and funneled the remaining capital directly into his shell companies. He did the exact same thing to Vivian's pension fund. He completely emptied your safety net and wired it overseas to cover his own catastrophic failures. Harrison was hyperventilating. He dropped the papers, taking a staggering step backward. He looked like he could not draw oxygen into his lungs. The federal agents, he wheezed, clutching his chest with a trembling hand. You said you work with the FBI. You can track the money, Zara. You are a cybersecurity expert. You can get it back. You have to get it back. I did track the money, I replied, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper. I tracked it right into the accounts of international criminals. The moment those funds crossed international borders and entered those specific offshore accounts, they were permanently frozen and seized by the Department of Homeland Security as part of an ongoing classified money laundering investigation. The money is gone, Harrison. The federal government has it, and it will remain locked in federal asset forfeiture for the next decade. The sheer crushing reality of their situation finally breached the thick walls of their lifelong denial. The illusion of their wealth, their status, and their untouchable legacy evaporated into thin air. They were no longer the prominent church elders. They were destitute victims of their own blinding arrogance. Vivian let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make. It was a blood-curdling primal scream that tore through the empty federal courtroom, echoing violently off the wooden panels. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a level of despair that shook her entire frame. Her pristine high society mask was entirely destroyed. She was weeping for her lost mansion, for her lost country club memberships, and for the utter terrifying reality she was about to face. She would have to pack her bags and leave her neighborhood in disgrace. Harrison grabbed the lapels of his suit, clutching his chest as if his heart were physically breaking in half. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed into the heavy wooden chair behind the plaintiff's table, his breathing shallow and ragged. The golden son-in-law, the man they had chosen over their own flesh and blood, had robbed them completely blind. Derek had stripped them of their dignity, their home, and their future. You have absolutely nothing left, I stated, delivering the final definitive verdict. You traded my future to fund Chloe's aesthetic. You traded Grandma B's life to protect your social standing. You worshipped a con artist because he drove a leased Mercedes and told you exactly what you wanted to hear. You built your empire on a foundation of lies, and now you get to live in the ruins. I picked up my empty briefcase. I did not feel an ounce of pity as I looked at the 2 weeping, broken people sitting at the table. They had earned every single second of this devastation. Enjoy your retirement, Harrison, I said. I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and stepped out into the bright, clean hallway of the federal building. I did not look back. The Washington family was finally permanently in my past. The heavy brass handles of the courtroom doors had barely swung shut behind me, sealing the suffocating despair of my parents inside, when a sudden violent clatter erupted. The solid oak doors burst open, slamming hard against the marble walls of the federal building corridor. Frantic, scrambling footsteps echoed sharply across the polished floor, completely destroying the quiet sanctuary of the hallway. I did not alter my pace. I kept walking, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing with absolute purpose, carrying me closer to the exit, closer to freedom. I had severed the biological obligation. I was done. Zara, wait. Please. The voice was a high-pitched, ragged shriek. It was stripped of all the pretentious, perfectly modulated cadence of a country club matriarch. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Vivian. I stopped, my hand resting lightly on the strap of my leather briefcase. I turned slowly. Vivian was running down the center of the vast, echoing corridor. She was a devastating sight. The immaculate, tailored Chanel suit she had worn to intimidate me was now crumpled and disheveled. Her pristine hair was plastered to her sweat-dampened forehead. Her expensive makeup was entirely ruined, running in dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks. Harrison was trailing a few paces behind her, stumbling like a man walking to his own execution. His chest heaved, his face utterly pale, completely drained of the arrogant pastoral authority he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. Vivian reached me, gasping for air. Before I could even register her movement, she collapsed. She did not just stumble, she threw herself entirely onto the cold, hard marble floor right at my feet. The woman who had spent 27 years telling her country club friends that my very existence was a tragic embarrassment was now groveling on the ground. She reached out with trembling hands, her manicured fingers desperately clutching at the hem of my trench coat. "Please," Vivian sobbed, her voice echoing pathetically off the high stone walls. "Please, Zara, you cannot leave us like this. You cannot just walk away and let everything burn. We have nothing left. Derek took everything, the retirement, the pension, the savings. We are completely ruined." I stared down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The spectacle unfolding at my feet should have elicited some shred of human sympathy, but the well was entirely dry. They had burned the bridge, salted the earth, and danced on the ashes. "Get up, Vivian," I stated, my voice completely flat. "You are embarrassing yourself in a federal building." "No," she wailed, her grip tightening on my coat, her face contorted in a mask of absolute desperation. "You have to fix this. You just proved to the judge that you run a massive corporate empire. You work with the federal government. You are a CEO. You are rich. You have to help us. You're our daughter." The sheer, unbridled audacity of her words hung in the sterile air of the corridor. I looked from the weeping woman on the floor to the broken man standing silently behind her. Harrison could not even look me in the eye. He simply stared at the marble tiles, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, hoping his wife's pathetic groveling would somehow save him from the consequences of his own monumental hubris. My mind immediately flashed back to the endless cycle of rejection that had defined my entire childhood. I remembered standing in the kitchen at 16, proudly holding up my first perfect report card, only to be told to move out of the way because Chloe needed to showcase her new cheerleading uniform. I remembered sitting alone in a cheap freezing apartment on Thanksgiving, eating canned soup because I was explicitly uninvited from their lavish holiday dinner. They had told their church congregation I was studying abroad to cover up the fact that they simply did not want me ruining their perfect family aesthetic. I remembered the night I begged them to help me pay for a basic medical procedure, only to be told that I was a financial drain and a continuous disappointment. They had never treated me as a daughter. I was a prop that failed to match the decor. I was a secret to be kept in the dark. I slowly reached down and peeled Vivian's trembling fingers off my coat one by one. I stepped back, severing the physical contact, creating a cold, impenetrable boundary between my reality and her delusion. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, unwavering register. You made that explicitly clear a decade ago when you drained my trust fund to buy ice sculptures and imported champagne for Chloe's wedding. You made that clear when you told your entire congregation that I was a jealous failure who refused to apply herself. You made that clear when you let me sleep in a freezing car and told me it was divine punishment. Vivian let out a choked sob, shaking her head frantically. We were wrong. We see that now. We were so terribly wrong. We will apologize to the whole church. We will tell everyone how successful you are. Just please, Zara, pay off the commercial mortgage. Save the house. We have nowhere to go. I looked down at her with eyes made of absolute solid ice. I refused to be moved by the tears of the woman who had mercilessly mocked my very existence. I am exactly what you called me, I stated, delivering the words with surgical precision. An inconvenience. Harrison finally stepped forward. His voice was a weak, trembling shadow of its former self. Zara, please, we are begging you. You have the capital. You can clear the debt with a single phone call. The bank is foreclosing. They are going to take the house. We will be out on the street. You cannot let your own parents become homeless. It is unnatural. It is ungodly. I let out a slow, dark laugh. The sound echoed down the hallway, utterly devoid of warmth. You really do not listen, Harrison, I replied, maintaining a perfectly rigid posture. You are still operating under the delusion that you have time to fix this. You are still hoping for a miracle that will preserve your suburban sanctuary. You think the foreclosure process is just beginning. You think you can negotiate with the bank. I unlocked the gold clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click snapped through the air, causing both of them to flinch. I reached inside the front compartment. I did not bring this up inside the courtroom because it was entirely irrelevant to Derek's federal criminal charges, I explained smoothly, pulling out a thick legal manila envelope. His Ponzi scheme, his wire fraud, his complicity in Grandma B's death, those were matters for the federal judge. But this is a purely personal matter. I held the envelope in my right hand. It was heavy with certified notarized documents. Derek stopped paying the commercial mortgage on your house 6 months ago. I continued, my voice echoing with terrifying calm. The offshore lenders liquidated the debt and sold the defaulted mortgage to a domestic asset recovery firm. That firm initiated the final non-judicial foreclosure proceedings exactly 30 days ago. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her throat. 30 days. No, they have to give us notice. They have to send letters. They did send letters, I corrected her instantly. They sent them directly to the registered financial agent on file. They sent them to Derek. He threw them in the shredder to keep you quiet while he tried to flee the country. The grace period expired last week. Harrison's eyes bulged in pure terror. He took a stumbling step toward me. Then the house is going to auction. We still have time. We can declare bankruptcy. We can file an injunction to stop the sale. You are too late, Harrison, I stated, dropping the ultimate crushing checkmate directly onto the board. Your house went into foreclosure last month, but don't worry, the bank already auctioned it off this morning. My company bought it, which means you are currently living in my house. And as the legal owner, I'm serving you with a 30-day eviction notice. I pulled the documents out of the envelope. They were crisp clean and stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. I held them up so Harrison could read the bold black ink across the top of the deed transfer. Sentinel Cybersecurity's Real Estate Holdings Division purchased the deed in full in cash. The transaction cleared 2 hours ago. The title has already been transferred to my name. Harrison stared at the paper, his mouth hanging open. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a freight train. He blinked rapidly, his brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to process the data. Vivian stopped sobbing. She looked up from the floor, her makeup-ruined face frozen in an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. She stared at me as if I were a terrifying alien entity. The daughter she had banished to the basement was now the sole legal owner of the mansion she worshipped above all else. I thrust the official notarized legal papers directly into Harrison's trembling chest. He reflexively brought his hands up, clutching the documents as if they were burning his skin. The heavy stack of papers detailed the immediate termination of their residency, the strict timeline for vacating the premises, and the absolute lack of any legal recourse. "You have exactly 1 month to pack your belongings and vacate my property," I instructed, my tone purely transactional. "If you damage the interior, if you attempt to strip the fixtures, or if you are not completely off the premises by midnight on the 30th day, I will have the local sheriff's department physically remove you for trespassing." Vivian let out another guttural scream, collapsing completely onto the marble floor. She curled into a ball, weeping hysterically, her hands clutching at the cold stone. She was entirely broken, a shattered remnant of a woman who had traded her soul for a social status that no longer existed. Harrison stood paralyzed, staring down at the eviction notice in his hands. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a path down his ashen cheek. He finally understood the magnitude of his failure. The fake empire was gone. The golden child was going to federal prison. The stolen wealth was seized. And the daughter he had treated like trash now held the deed to the only thing he had left. I did not offer another word. The transaction was complete. The audit was finished. I turned my back on the sobbing woman on the floor and the paralyzed man clutching his eviction notice. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase on my shoulder, my posture perfectly straight, my conscience perfectly clear. I walked down the long, echoing marble corridor toward the heavy glass exit doors, stepping out into the bright, clean air of the city, leaving the Washington family to rot in the ruins of their own making. Before I could reach the end of the long marble corridor, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung violently open behind me. The loud crash of wood striking the stone walls made me pause and turn around. The two armed court bailiffs who had initially detained Derek were stepping out into the hallway. But they were not alone. Two federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing crisp dark suits and carrying heavy steel lockboxes, flanked them. I recognized both agents immediately. They were the lead investigators from the Financial Crimes Division, the exact agents who had been waiting in the hall at my explicit behest. We had coordinated this precise handoff hours before the trial even began. They approached Derek, whose expensive designer suit was now wrinkled and soaked in nervous sweat. The slick, arrogant wealth manager who had scoffed at my existence was gone, replaced by a trembling, hyperventilating coward. Derek Vance, the lead FBI agent, announced, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority down the corridor. "You are being transferred into federal custody. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." The agent grabbed Derek by the shoulder, forcefully spinning him around. The sharp metallic ratcheting of federal handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists snapped through the air. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a completely destroyed empire. Derek did not fight them. He did not claim his innocence. He simply dropped his head toward his chest and began to sob loudly, the pathetic, broken wails of a man who finally realized he was going to spend the rest of his natural life inside a maximum security penitentiary. As the agents began to haul Derek away, a frantic scrambling noise erupted from the courtroom doors. Chloe burst out into the hallway. She looked entirely unrecognizable. The perfectly manicured high society princess had been completely obliterated. Her custom-tailored dress was twisted, her expensive heels were scuffed, and her face was a smeared, horrifying mess of dark mascara and terrified tears. She watched in absolute paralysis as the federal agents marched her husband toward the freight elevators, dragging away her source of stolen wealth, her status, and her freedom. Then she saw me. She locked onto me, standing calmly near the exit doors, holding my leather briefcase. A wild, unhinged desperation flashed across her eyes. She practically lunged down the hallway, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She threw herself toward me, her hands reaching out in pure panic. "Zara, please!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, ragged sob. She grabbed the sleeve of my trench coat, her fingers digging into the fabric with a frantic, animalistic grip. I stood perfectly still, looking down at her clutching hands with an expression of absolute, unyielding ice. I did not pull away immediately. I simply let her feel the cold, horrifying reality of her own complete powerlessness. "Zara, you have to stop them!" Chloe begged, her chest heaving as tears poured down her ruined face. You work for them. You are the CEO. Just tell them to drop the charges. Tell them we will give the money back. I have nothing left. The bank accounts are frozen. The credit cards are declined. I do not even have a place to sleep tonight. Give me something for a lawyer. Please. We are sisters. The word hung in the air, pathetic and entirely hollow. Sisters, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that made her flinch. I slowly raised my hand and brushed her trembling fingers off my coat, treating her touch like a toxic contaminant. She shrank back, her breath hitching in her throat, as she looked up at me, waiting for the lifeline she felt inherently entitled to. She genuinely believed that because we shared the same bloodline, I would magically forget a lifetime of psychological torture. She thought her tears would somehow erase the audio recording of her listening to our grandmother choke to death while worrying about her party schedule. I reached into the pocket of my trench coat. Chloe's eyes widened with a sudden, desperate flash of hope. She thought I was pulling out a checkbook. She thought I was pulling out a corporate credit card. She thought she was getting her bailout. Instead, I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I held it up between my index and middle finger, letting the green paper catch the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor. Chloe stared at the money, her brow furrowing in deep, panicked confusion. "Take an Uber, Chloe," I instructed, my voice surgically precise and entirely devoid of human sympathy. I opened my fingers, letting the crisp $20 bill flutter slowly through the air until it landed softly on the cold marble floor right next to her scuffed designer shoes. "Since you are so worried about the rain," Chloe let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the ultimate crushing insult finally registered. It was the exact sum our mother had thrown at me when they abandoned me at an airport years ago. It was the exact excuse she had used to avoid calling paramedics for Grandma B. She stared down at the $20 bill, completely paralyzed by the sheer devastating finality of my words. She had brought a lifetime of cruelty to the table, and I had returned it with a single perfectly executed checkmate. I turned away from her sobbing, crumbling figure. I gathered my folders, securing my briefcase firmly in my hand. I looked back down the long corridor toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. Judge Sterling was standing in the doorway. He had stepped out from the bench, watching the entire exchange unfold in the hall. His face was stern, his posture commanding, but as our eyes met across the distance, his expression shifted. He gave me a slow, silent nod of absolute respect. It was a quiet acknowledgement between two professionals who understood that true justice had finally been served. I returned the nod, acknowledging the gavel that had sealed their fate. I turned on my heel and walked down the final stretch of the center aisle. The sound of my footsteps was steady, confident, and entirely unburdened. I reached the heavy glass doors at the entrance of the federal building and pushed them open, stepping out into the world. The torrential storm that had raged against the windows all morning had completely passed. The dark, heavy clouds had fractured, giving way to a brilliant, vibrant blue sky. The city streets were washed clean, glistening with fresh rainwater. As I walked down the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, the bright, radiant sunlight hit my face, warming my skin and casting away the last lingering shadows of my past. An armored, immaculate black Cadillac Escalade was idling smoothly at the curb. The tinted windows gleamed in the afternoon sun. As I approached, my private driver stepped out immediately. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his posture rigidly professional. He opened the heavy rear door of the SUV, offering a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, CEO Washington," he said smoothly. "To the airport." "To the airport," I confirmed, my voice light and clear. I climbed into the luxurious leather interior of the Cadillac. The door closed with a solid, comforting thud, sealing me inside a quiet, secure fortress of my own making. I settled into the seat, watching through the tinted glass as the federal building shrank in the rearview mirror. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. The entire Washington family was completely destroyed, drowning in a sea of federal indictments, foreclosures, and absolute public disgrace. The CEO simply leaned back against the headrest, closed her eyes, and drove away, leaving the ashes of a deeply toxic family far behind her.